Okay, so the issue I'm going to discuss here, I have raised before, but I think it's a very important issue and I think it's worth raising again. Among other things, I've got a lot of videos on my channel, and if someone didn't come across the last one, they might come across this. So good to have two copies, I guess. Just a very quick word. It's got nothing to do with the video, but I just want to mention it in passing. I had a look at the Sunderland half marathon today. I've never been a strong runner. I'm quite physically strong, but I've never been a strong runner. And a huge respect for anyone who takes part in any marathon. It's physically very grueling, and the money goes to a good cause. Money is raised for charity. It gets people healthy. It's a good event. So huge respect to the runners who took part in that. Um, got quite a good vantage point that wasn't too crowded near my house. Okay, so the issue I want to talk about is media accountability and the tactics that the press use. In the West, and now I'm speaking in generic terms here because I'm referring to more than one country, in recent years there has been a lot of backlash against mainstream media, as as critics would put it, by which I mean, or which I assume they mean, big established broadcast news networks, the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, etc. Um, I'm a little bit critical of the term simply because I think sometimes it can be used to give sanction to other news sources as being entirely truthful, and I don't think that any news source is without bias, or very few are. For example, some of the people who attack mainstream media seem to have no problem endorsing the propaganda of Russia Today. So that's a bit hypocritical. I'm not saying everyone does. I'm not saying everyone that talks about the mainstream media says that. But having said that, there are certain subjects mainstream media won't touch. Both CNN and the BBC can be incredibly politically correct, and they will not touch taboo subjects, or at least when they do, they report in such a way as I mean, the BBC is basically literally promoted the hijab rather than just opening it up as a forum for debate. They've literally promoted it as a good thing, and I think that is pathetic. And the BBC's PC has been long established. Anyway, I don't want to get into a deep, in-depth discussion, talk, whatever, about mainstream media. I want to talk about a particular tactic that I dislike deeply, which is doorstepping. Now, I'll come to that in a minute, but let me just say for the record, I am not. I can't agree with these people who are just against the media full stop, like, oh, they're all liars, it's all fake news. Um, I mean, among other things, Trump is a pathological liar. And I think Trump supporters just disregard the fact that he has lied through his teeth on many issues. And, that's a matter of fact. Okay. It's been verified by independent sources. Trump has been more times than is acceptable just an outright liar, and that is pretty disgraceful when he's in the position that he's in. Anyway, not to get derailed, I um, I have enormous respect for frontline journalists in particular. These are people who not only work very hard, it involves a lot of research, a lot of planning, a lot of strategy to do the things that they have to do. It also involves a lot of courage because they do risk death in countries like Iraq, Colombia, and in other parts of the world, Syria. Many journalists have been killed for doing their work. Um, and more common, but perhaps less reported, is how much journalists get harassed. Sometimes beaten up. Their equipment is taken away. They're held in detention for days. We've just seen the report of those two Reuters journalists freed in Myanmar, which a lot of people are saying, a lot of analysts are saying, don't get too excited about that because it's still an oppressive regime and journalists are still harassed there. In China, Journalists aren't necessarily killed, but they are definitely put under pressure to report to not report anything that deviates from the official Communist Party line. Foreign journalists, in particular, are put in this position where they're accused of spreading Western propaganda, yet they're not given access to news cases, and so they can't report fully. Um, their hands are tied. Uh, but they will go as far as they can without really jeopardizing the case. I mean, Matt Rivers' report on CNN was a recent example of this when he was investigating the concentration camps, and that's what I'm going to call them because I've seen nothing compelling from the Chinese regime to suggest otherwise in Xinjiang. So I have huge respect for frontline journalists of all networks, actually. It does take courage. So that goes without saying. But and having an independent media is incredibly, incredibly important to functioning democracy, because without it, when you have a government controlling the media, as is the case in China, the government simply, stirs it up to their way of thinking. Well, controls it to the way of thinking. There is absolutely so. If you look at Chinese journalists, they basically have to ask preset questions that will it'll be something like this. Very bureaucratic, boring questions. Things like, what does the chairman think about China's economic progress? And can the chairman tell us about how wonderful the progress is and how much this province has developed and how will this apply to Chinese trade internationally? They'll be very dull, very preset questions. Chinese journalists, at least not those controlled by the state, i.e. CGTN, will never ask difficult questions. They'll never say, how does the minister justify this position? How does the minister explain to the Chinese people this or that or the other? You will never get the sort of questions that someone like Laura Kuenssberg would ask leading British politicians. That is why an independent media is so precious because it holds the powerful to account. And that is why Western countries, notwithstanding the many flaws in our media, are far more advanced in that sense than China. You know, it's that is just something that goes without saying. You cannot have a functioning democracy where journalists can't freely ask those in power difficult questions. Now, having said all that, I mentioned I really have contention with doorstepping. Um, I think doorstepping is a vile practice. I actually made a formal complaint to the BBC about this because I felt strongly about it. And I'm someone who believes that if you complain about something, you need to act on it. You can't just whinge and not try and do something with it. So the response I got was a pretty pathetic response. I wasn't impressed by it. The guy that responded said, the reason we use this technique is to stop pulling around a particular area, and we try to judge that it won't put undue pressure on the person we're questioning. That's a pretty nonsense response. It just sounded like an excuse, a pretty meaningless excuse. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has actually said that he doesn't particularly like this tactic at his own house, and it's applies across the board. I don't buy that they're doing it to stop the concentration of journalists in other areas. I think outside the Houses of Parliament, it's totally legitimate to have lots of journalists congregated. And okay, there may be an issue about space, but if it's between that and harassing people on their own doorstep, then just frankly, journalists should just compromise among themselves or something. I do not think there is any public interest in ramming cameras in someone's face late at night outside their own home. I have a big problem with it. I think it's a paparazzi style tactic, and I think it's obnoxious in the extreme. And what I want to say to newspaper editors, and this isn't just the tabloids, by the way, it's respectable newspapers, so called respectable newspapers like the Times. So I would like to say to the editor of the Times, okay, tell me your home address. I'm going to bring a camera round to your house and ask you how you justify your editorial positions. I mean, he's in a powerful position. What's the difference? So a free press is extremely important, but so should be accountability of the press. And one of the problems in the United States is there is really no press accountability. And this is where Donald Trump at least has opened up a debate. You know, people can say Trump's war on the media is very bad for democracy. Maybe it is, but this is something that needs to be discussed. Why is it media pundits think they can just come out with all these opinions and not be held to account? Why is it CNN feels that they should be above criticism? I mean, in the UK, we're far from perfect, but at least we have Ofcom. I happen to think Ofcom has been very weak on the Chinese issue and on the Russian issue, but the very fact that we have it at all is a good thing. So I believe that everyone in power should be held to account. Everyone. Politicians, judges, celebrities, um, big company CEOs, top bankers, and media executives. Everyone who holds a position of power needs to be held to account, and religious leaders for that matter. If you're in a position of power, you need to be held to account. But one of the problems with the press freedom situation, in terms of how it is often spoken about, is they say, oh, we need press freedom to hold politicians, company CEOs, and so on to account. And it's mostly politicians. And that's fine, that's important. But my question is okay, do you accept that you also need to be held to account? And I find that when it turns on them and they're held to account, they have to say, oh, look, this is this is attack on press freedom. I mean, after the phone hacking business, which was an absolute can of worms. I don't think the culture has changed that much since then, incidentally. That's why I'm bringing it up. Um, there were a few muted apologies and, expressions of regret, but there was also a lot of self pity. Now, when journalists say we can self regulate, frankly, I don't trust them. It's not that I think they're all liars. I think that that is just a recipe for corruption because how can you have them self regulating? I believe that in every position of power, that's why we have the media to scrutinize politicians. Because politicians, if they were just monitoring themselves, then there might be good intentions there. There might be people with honest intentions. Another example would be the police. The police would say we have an internal mechanism for disciplinary procedures. But as has been seen in the United States, very often the police basically protect their own. Now, I'm a realist. I know that you can't take this to an absolute pure level whereby everyone is regulating everyone else because it would be practically very difficult. I understand that. But I think at the top level, there needs to be some sort of external regulation. Um, in other words, the media should hold politicians to account. Politicians should set legislation um, that puts some protection on individual privacy as well. I mean, when we talk about liberty, let's not forget privacy. Personal privacy surely is also a big part of liberty, and it's a human right. So, this idea that there's a public interest in going to someone's house at 11 o'clock at night and ramming a camera in their face, I just don't buy that for a second. I am not totally against going to someone's home. If it's a daytime and if it's done in a respectful way, but the point about doorstepping is it's often pretty aggressive. I mean, I suppose the counter argument is politicians canvass. They go around to people's homes to sell their party because they have to do it. It's part of campaigning at election time, and I think they should do it at other times of the year, incidentally. But so I suppose I can't say that there should be absolutely no scope for journalists to go to politicians' homes. But here's my contention. I mean, when that's being filmed, because canvassing isn't filmed, so it's much less of an attack on privacy or a violation of privacy. When you're filming something for a news program and you're pushing a politician on their doorstep, remember they have families who are not public figures, who are not in the public eye. My issue is not so much about the politician themselves. They've chosen to be in the public arena. Their family hasn't. When Chuka Umunna was running for the Labour leadership, one of the reasons he pulled out, he cited, was that the press were congregating outside a house where his elderly grandmother lived. So this is an issue I really take. The press need to have some standards. They need to understand this is someone's house. It's not their office. It's not the Palace of Westminster. It's their house. And when journalists think that, when they get into these aggressive paparazzi style tactics, it's very hard to respect that. It does make me angry. I think politicians need to be accessible to the media. So, they can't always avoid the cameras. That is also not a good trait. Ever since the 60s, politicians have known the power of the media. So, it makes sense for them to utilize it as much as anything else. Anyway, I'll round this up, but this all comes down to mutual accountability. I believe that everyone in a position of power should be held to account. Everyone. So the media's job, as I see it, is to hold the powerful to account. But that doesn't mean that they should be above scrutiny. And when they use tactics like this, they can't just hide behind press freedom, you know, because I see no public interest in what they're doing with that sort of doorstepping technique, particularly at night time and particularly when it's done in an aggressive manner.